what do you consider to be the most unethical thing in humanity in current times?
Well, I mean, factory farming is probably number one. I'm also very concerned about global poverty and the fact that people in affluent societies do not do nearly enough to help people in extreme poverty and to improve their living conditions and help them get out of poverty. So I think that's a major moral issue as well. But in terms of the amount of suffering that goes on in the world that is for which humans are responsible, I think factory farming is probably number one because of the incredible scale of it, right? Even if we stick only to vertebrate animals, we're talking, by the estimates I've seen, of something like 200 billion animals a year being factory farmed. Pretty much all of them in really bad conditions that don't give them a decent life, and many of them suffering extreme pain in various ways. You can go into details about that if you want.
I have read Animal Liberation Now quite recently, so
Good. Okay, you've got a lot of the details already then, yeah.
And this is your views, of course, as one of a prominent philosopher, but would you say there's a consensus among academic philosophers in the world that factory farming is unjustifiable?
Yes, I think so. I think you put it exactly right there. If you'd said, is there a consensus that we should be vegetarian or vegan? Probably not. But if you say that factory farming is morally wrong, is unethical, yes. It's not maybe it's not 100% consensus. There's a small number of philosophers who you might say for one reason or another that the suffering of animals doesn't matter, but it's very close to, in my experience.
So the discussion must be much about animal raising, animal production in more decent, perhaps small scale or humane conditions with higher welfare standards.
Well, it could be. That would be an important thing to do, and that would greatly reduce the amount of suffering, and it would probably mean that factory farming, was no longer the number one concern if in fact it more or less disappeared and instead we had small scale, more humane raising of animals. That would certainly be, in my view, a great improvement. Yes. I don't think we would be able to eat nearly as much animal products. They would be more expensive, clearly, but they might also be more sustainable in the long run.
And some proponents of more small-scale farming with better conditions would say that I give animals life that they wouldn't have if I didn't raise them, and they wouldn't exist at all. So I give something positive in the world. What would you say to that argument?
Well, I think that's it's not an unreasonable argument to put forward. If the animals do have positive lives, of course, just let's assume that the animals have positive lives throughout their life, they're well looked after, and then they get killed in a reasonably humane way, hopefully without being trucked at long distances to slaughter. I think that raises a difficult philosophical issue. I think a lot of lay people don't realize that this is quite a serious and difficult issue, which of course Derek Parfit discusses at length as far as humans are concerned, but it also applies quite straightforwardly to non-human animals. If you bring an animal into existence and it has a good life, and then you kill it painlessly, have you harmed the animal? And the argument is it's hard to say that you've harmed it when you've given it this good life and it's, let's say, died without pain, and it wouldn't have existed otherwise. So how is that a harm, I guess, is the question.
My counter argument that I sometimes give is that, okay, if we decrease or even take away farming of animals altogether, we can leave more room for wild animals. But some say, oh, but the life in the wild is a lot of suffering, and they will die from predators or starvation. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting, relatively new issue that has been raised maybe 20 years. Philosophers have been started to talking about the suffering of wild animals and whether, in fact, we should try to reduce it in some way, or at least not increase it. And I think it's reasonably plausible to say that well looked after, free-ranging farmed animals have better lives than wild animals on the whole. That's a generalization, obviously, and there are many wild animals that will have good lives, but there's also a lot of suffering, as you just said. In droughts or storms or bad conditions or whatever, the animals will suffer and die, wild animals, whereas the farmers will protect them from the worst weather conditions. The babies, their young ones may die at a higher rate. Will depend on the species, but of course some species reproduce large numbers, and it's expected that many of them will die. So I don't think you could say that the lives of farmed animals are worse than the lives of this kind of farmed animal we're talking about, are worse than the lives of wild animals. In some cases, at least, there's environmental arguments. So if you're talking about cattle and sheep, for example, because they're ruminants, they produce a lot of methane, and I think that's a problem that you don't get to the same extent with plant-based food. So there are some environmental arguments that are relevant there, but
also biodiversity arguments to have wildlife instead of stock.
Yes.
Wild animals provide much more biodiversity than the cattle.
Yes, that would be true too.
I am a wannabe diehard meat eater, though I'm reducing a lot nowadays, but still I would like to have to be able to eat the meat with a good conscience. I look at it this way: we should weigh animal suffering against the benefit and happiness it brings to perhaps humans. Couldn't such accounting lead to the conclusion that it's actually justifiable to subject animals to sufferings in order to produce food that makes humans not only full but also happy? Could we ever get to that conclusion?
Well, I would doubt that we could, for a couple of reasons. One is, if we are causing them suffering, I'm not quite sure whether you're now referring only to really, high standard, small scale animal husbandry, or whether you're talking about factory farms.
Let's say the dairy industry, the normal dairy industry.
Okay, so the normal dairy industry, you're in Sweden, right?
In Sweden, yeah.
You're not in the United States. There was a fire in Texas a year or so ago, and it was reported that a barn caught fire and 18,000 dairy cows died. So there were 18,000 dairy cows in this one barn, right? So that's, I take it, not normal for Sweden, but that is a large part of US dairy production is now very large scale, very crowded. The cows are not grazing in the fields, except during the brief period when they're pregnant and waiting to give birth. They might be, but otherwise they're tied up inside all the time. So I wouldn't see that as a universally high standard. It may be in some countries. And then you have to consider when you're talking about the happiness, pleasure that we get from eating animal products, it is, of course, only the margin of extra happiness that we get as compared to eating plant-based foods. And to some extent, I think that's just acculturation, or what you're used to eating. I mean, I'm an Australian. I grew up eating a lot of meat. Meat was very cheap here, and of high quality. And when I went to Oxford to do my graduate work, some of my Australian friends said, "Oh, you won't like it in England because the meat is terrible. It's really poor quality compared to Australia." So I grew up eating good quality meat, but after about a year or so after I got to Oxford, I decided that I ought to become a vegetarian, and it was a bit hard at first. And part of the problem was that we had these recipes. My wife and I was already married. We're both of European descent. We had these European-style recipes, which were very heavily meat-based. And so for a while, we tried using textured vegetable protein instead of the meat. And the textured vegetable protein at that stage was terrible. I mean, I think it's got a bit better now, but still probably not great. So, yes, we suffered from eating this stuff that wasn't as good as meat. But then we started adjusting, and we started doing a lot more Indian cooking, a lot more Chinese cooking, Mediterranean cooking, which was not so heavily meat-centered. And I think now we enjoy our food as much as we ever did, I have to say. I don't think we feel we're missing something by not eating meat. It's true that we would have somewhat greater diversity, but there's a lot of variety in animal-free meating as well.
What you are saying is that my happiness from eating meat is a cultural thing that I could exchange to other kind of happiness, including meals, for instance.
Yes, that's right. You could, there would be a period of adjustment for you, I suppose. But after a relatively short period, you would be just as happy as you were before. And maybe you would be happier also in the respect that you don't have to worry about whether the animals you're treating did suffer or not. That might make you feel good about yourself too.
That is also a benefit.
And Peter, as you mentioned, the happiness you get from eating meat, it might be there, but it's small compared to the suffering. Let's say in the Swedish dairy industry, the calf is taken away within 24 hours from its mother. Right. Only that, I mean, to live without your parents would cost.
Yes, that's true. I should have mentioned that. Yeah, that's a factor about all dairy, really. Yeah. Actually, I don't know if it exists. I mentioned it in Animal Liberation Now. There's a dairy farm in Australia which uses sperm selection so that the cows only produce female calves, and then they leave the calves with the mothers. And so they only take the surplus milk that the calves don't want. Of course, the milk costs about 6 times as much as a normal kind of cow's milk. So I suppose it's theoretically possible to have calves running with the cows, but it almost never happens.
Mm. We did go to one very unique farm, Torbjörn and me, to a study visit where the calf is allowed to go with the mother. But
was that in Sweden or somewhere else? Yeah.
But I haven't heard about that in any other place, so it's very rare. Yeah.
I think there was one in Germany I read about somewhere.
Yeah, there is some ongoing research to get to a system where you could have a calf longer with a mother. But of course, you lose production, and it's not mainstream, and it's not. I mean, it's not a solution for everybody because the milk is going to be at least twice as expensive. It's now 50 years since you published Animal Liberation. What impact has this work had for the animals, would you say?
Well, it's hard to really, say what is responsible for what. I mean, the impact that I see most clearly is there are a lot of people who say that they became vegetarian or vegan, and in some cases became influential people in the animal movement because of reading Animal Liberation. I suppose the most prominent is Ingrid Newkirk, who went on to co-found People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, which he still is involved with. It's the largest radical animal organization, pro-animal organization in the world, and I think it's done a lot of good. And there's some European leaders who say something similar. The most positive changes I see are things that have happened in only some countries, but the European Union is one of them. That's the legislation which got rid of the standard battery cages for laying hens, also got rid of individual crates for veal calves, and the individual gestation stalls for mother pigs, for breeding sows. So they, I think, are significant reforms that have improved the lives of hundreds of millions of animals. Is Animal Liberation responsible for them? Well, certainly not wholly responsible for them. Maybe it contributed by changing the thinking of some people who perhaps became activists and were part of the animal movement. But if you said to me, so do I think that Animal Liberation is like 10% of the cause of those changes or 30%? I would have no way of estimating that,
No, but still, animals aren't really liberated yet.
No, they're certainly not, and no, they're still inside. And some industries, I think, have changed rather little. The chicken industry, in particular, which I think is one of the worst forms of factory farming. Not very much has changed in 50 years there.
And Peter, some might even say that we might have a bit more space for animals. Some of them get rid of the cages, but they're still locked up. And then they have the argument to say, "Oh, look how good welfare we have for the animals, and how protective laws we have." So that might be an argument to continue in eating animal products. What would you say to that?
Yes, might persuade some people that they can continue to eat animal products. I mean, that's been debated in the animal movement for quite a long time now between the so-called abolitionists and the welfarists. But the problem is that, you know, the abolitionists have not been able to make any progress, really. Yes, there are more vegetarians and vegans, but it's not like where the keeping of animals is worst, there are more vegetarians and vegans. And in those countries that have enacted some of these slightly more humane laws, there are fewer vegetarians and vegans. It's actually the reverse of the truth, right? There are more vegetarians and vegans in precisely those places that have got better laws. So I don't see much evidence that welfare improvements actually, you know, do anything to maintain the meat industry. I think it's being maintained there anyway.
Yeah, good point.
So what should we do, Peter? People like to eat meat. They don't disregard the moral aspects of it. They want their meat.
I mean, that's certainly something that I did not really appreciate 50 years ago. How hard it is to change the dietary habits of some people, because, as I said, my wife and I found it relatively easily, and we were friends with other people in Oxford at the time who also made the change and found it quite enjoyable and easy to do. But there are obviously some people who just, you know, are not prepared to stop eating meat, and they're also not prepared to search out for the more conscientiously produced kinds of meat. So one option here is to hope that we develop better techniques for producing either plant-based or cellular meat, you know, that seemed to be quite hopeful maybe 10 or 5 years ago, but recently there's been this reaction against what's termed ultra-processed food, which I think has reduced the sales of the plant-based burgers. The progress in making cellular meat, although some of it has now come on the market, it's very expensive still, and there's no sign that it's going to compete on price with meat from live animals. So we've still got a long way to go there too, I think. I hope that it makes more progress. But
did you read this book yet?
Yeah. I have it on my desk. No, I mean, I know Bruce Friedrich as well. I've known Bruce for 30, maybe 40 years now.
But in spite of this backlash we have seen and many companies failing that try to do this, he's very optimistic. It seems like we will get a breakthrough in a few years or maybe a decade or two.
Yeah. Yes, he is, and I hope he's right. The reason I'm not highly confident is that people have told us, you know, the saying, "Oh, it's only 5 years away before it comes to market and competes with meat from animals." We've been hearing that for 20 years now.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
As a meat eater, I would just say that if the alternative gets less pricey and just as tasty, I would shift tomorrow, because I like to save my money. So if there was an alternative for me, I mean, I'm not an ideologically meat eater. I don't have to do it. I'm not going to die for it, but I would like to have an easy way out here. Yeah.
Well, it may come. I mean, the Chinese are working on it in quite a large scale now. I was reading something about you know, China is concerned about its food security, And the moment, of course, they import a lot of grains and soy to feed to their factory farmed animals. So they are actually funding research into cellular kinds of ways of producing meat. They did that with solar cells and so on, with photoelectric solar electricity production, and they're now really the world leaders in that area. So maybe they'll become the world leaders in producing meat without animals as well. I hope so.
And some say that now meat consumption and meat production is going up and up and up globally, but that might not be sustainable in just a decade or something, because of the climate and because of other. I mean, the land is also getting used up quite quickly, and if we cut down all the forests, they will be even worse, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. It might, yes. Yeah, I think as we replace fossil fuels, which is happening, even in America, there's still despite Trump, there's still shifting to use of electricity more, and so as we do that, then meat will be a larger portion of the greenhouse gases that we emit, and so I think there may be more focus on reducing meat consumption again, especially ruminants.
As an activist, I've also been in the peace movement and climate movement and now animal rights, but of course I'm looking historically at how change has been done before, like the abolition of slavery, women's rights, children's rights, rights of homosexuals, and I see they have succeeded in quite large part with their goals. But would you say that the struggle for animal rights is even harder than those struggles for humans?
It may be, because I mean, our use of animals is more, entrenched throughout our societies. Even when slavery was at its height, not everybody owned slaves or was dependent on slaves. There were certainly large parts of the world that were not. So it may be harder than that. Yeah. What you said reminded me of the book by Rutger Bregman called Moral Ambition. Are you familiar with that? Yeah.
I read it, yes. Very good.
Yeah, so I think he makes an interesting case, and he talks about animals and factory farming as well. He's hopeful that those successes of the anti-slavery movement can be repeated for animals.
But don't you also think that we are a species, everyone, I think, even animal rights activists are a species, that we are so ingrown, like with the thinking that humans are above all other species? Don't you think that's a big part of it?
It is a big part of it, yes. And of course, in some sense, we are, right? Depends what you mean by above. We are cognitively superior. We are better at predicting things that are going to happen that animals can't predict, really. So we in that sense, we're justified in being paternalistic towards animals, and as we are with our own children, but not with other adults. So there are differences, but my position is that when it comes to suffering, clearly they can suffer, and there's no reason to think that because their cognitive capacity is not the same as ours, that they may not suffer just as much. There will be some kinds of suffering that they will not experience. Obviously, they won't be depressed at what's happening in factory farms when they're running through the woods, but the kinds of suffering that they do experience may be just as severe as we can experience.
Aren't there evidence also that they might suffer more because they don't have the capacity to think that this might end? They're more in the now than we are.
Yes, that's quite possible, I think. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the fact that I can agree that it's morally wrong to hold animals, kill them and eat them, but still I want to do that. And I think that's very human, to do the wrong thing. Even if you know that something is right, you want to do the wrong thing.
But do we want to do the wrong thing for its own sake, or do we want to do what's convenient and what's habitual and so on? And perhaps we don't want to stand out from the crowd. I mean, I think one factor, not for everybody perhaps, but one factor for a lot of people is, oh, if I stop eating animals, then when I eat with my family or some circle of friends where most of them do eat animals, I will kind of be implicitly criticizing what they're doing, and I don't want to be in that position. You think that's a factor?
Yeah, definitely a factor.
Yeah.
We do like other people do. So if we can get a small change, that can grow. And then
that's right. So we need to get this critical mass that we can feel that there are lots of people doing that.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Peter, for taking the time. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.